Verse 18. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on the rocky ground, this is one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such person has no root, but endures only for a while, and then trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, and that person immediately falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. This is the gospel of the Lord. Oh, you better, I think Casey's on meeting in. There's someone in the waiting room. So recently, and I'm kind of not excited about announcing this in public, just because I'm afraid I'll be bound to actually doing it. But recently, I started gathering together stories for what I think will become a devotional book based on my experiences with my grandmother. Pray that I have the persistence to make that a reality, but I got 2 chapters outlined, so I'm on the roll. One of the stories that I pulled to use in one of the chapters that I actually just finished was the story about my grandmother's garden. My grandmother was an avid, and I will say reckless, gardener. Her garden was crazy. It grew everywhere. The variety of plants in her garden reflected her kind of eclectic personality. She tended to the flowers nearly every single day, once the weather was nice enough, even before they had started growing. She was always then, throughout the warm months, tending to the flowers and separating out the bulbs and thinning out that thing and thinning out that thing and cutting this thing. One year, she even successfully spliced one tree onto another tree. She had a giant rhododendron, and I remember once she decided she wanted to make it look like a giant bonsai tree, and she did. Her garden had everything from roses that just seemed to grow wild everywhere to the opulent and always overdressed, my favorite, the irises. The story that I focus on, though, actually links my grandmother to one of my favorite literary characters, The Little Prince. It is one of my favorite books even to this day. And if you know the story, one of the big moments in the Little Prince's life, right, is when his little rose appears. This rose begins to grow on his little tiny planet. And he is beside himself with joy that this beautiful, beautiful rose has grown. And so he becomes enraptured with this rose. But there's a problem on his planet. And that problem is there are these things called Baobabs, which are thorny weeds, and they grow rampant on his little planet. And so he spends all day pulling these weeds and fighting these weeds and trying to keep the weeds away from his pretty little rose. The rose, by the way, was a little spoiled, but we'll put that aside for now. But every single day of his life, he wakes up to fight the Baobabs. His entire life until he leaves his little planet is pulling weeds to protect this little rose. My grandmother had these things in her roses that she referred to, I don't know what they were called, as strangleweed. They were little horticultural menaces, little botanical terrorists in her garden, always growing, just growing and growing and growing, and always wrapping around her beloved roses. I had seen the weeds. I'd been out in the yard with her trying to destroy them. I had been there. I'm part of the battle trying to pull up these horrible baobabs growing everywhere in her yard. And they were so nasty and they were so hard to pull off of things. And they were all over. Their roots were all over. Tentacles everywhere, these little strangle weeds. And my grandmother battled these weeds relentlessly because she loved those roses so much that she refused to let anything harm them. And she was not a pesticide user, So the only thing she had left to do was to battle physically with the strangleweed. And when Grandma planted something, she wanted it to grow, right? She wanted it to thrive. And so she made sure it was safe, and she made sure that it was nourished and that it had water and sunlight and all of that stuff. She did all these things to make sure that this incredible garden of hers would keep growing. And she spent her entire life, until she couldn't do it anymore, battling those weeds. I want you to hold on to that story for a moment. Now, what I'm about to do, and this is where we're going to take a slightly left turn, so bear with me. I'm going to do something to this passage that has a fancy name. It's called an exegetical extension. That basically just means that I want to dive into these metaphors a little more deeply. And so I'm going to try to follow them sort of to a conclusion, because I think there is a second message that is in this parable. And so I want to look at how this parable speaks to us, particularly now, in this particular moment. And so I'm going to propose that there is an extension of this parable, and if you look at it in a very particular way, or if you look at it at all, through a particular context, I don't think I'm stretching too much. But I think in this parable, Jesus is not just offering us the problems faced by the seeds, he is offering us the solutions to the problems faced by the seeds. The parable tells us that the sower is spreading seeds, right? This guy is throwing seeds everywhere, and some are falling on paths and some on rocks. And on the path is a place with no life-sustaining stuff. There is nothing to grow on. It is too hard to establish roots. It is too hard sometimes for water to even soak into it. And the seeds don't even start there. They don't even sprout. Not even a little baby plant comes up on the path. They are instead devoured by these birds. The Baobabs of the sky, I guess. The birds become this kind of metaphor, right? For evil. The parable, Jesus tells us that, the consuming evil of the world, right? That can take hold because there is no foundation of faith. There are no roots. There is nothing to pull from. And so these people become perfect prey for the flock of the birds. The seeds on the rocks have a very similar problem. Yes, there's a little bit of soil, right? Enough to kind of sprout, enough to let a little baby plant come out of it. Jesus compares this to the kind of initial rush of enthusiasm that comes with faith. I call this my conversion. Suddenly, faith was an incredible rush of enthusiasm, right? Everything looked different. The whole world looked different. Possibilities were everywhere and so much hope. And I thought that in that moment that God reached down to grab me from the world, every day was going to be like that. That I'd wake up every morning and God would grab me out of the world and shake me into faith, right? Now, I'm not saying that what God does is false. God does all those things. But without the foundation, without growing up, right, with any sort of religious foundation at all, I didn't have what I needed at that moment to truly and faithfully and spiritually process what was happening to me. And I'm not going to lie to you, the day after was a deep disappointment. And since for me, there is literally nothing worse than being scorched by the sun, that disappointment was truly scorching. I understood then what it took to sustain faith and even to sustain religious belief. It was to find ways to form it and to nourish it and to study it and to feed the heart and the soul and the brain. The shallowness of paths and rocks can never sustain life. They can never sustain wisdom. And the weeds, to me, of course, as the story I just told you about my grandmother indicates, are the clearest metaphor to me. The seeds do grow. They appear to be thriving. Plants have emerged. They have found soil. They are apparently being cared for at some length. They are watered enough to grow. Nourishment maybe remains to be seen. But suddenly into their midst comes the temptations of the world, the distractions of the world, the problems of the world, the cares of the world, and the lure of wealth, Jesus says, choke the word. Now, if you haven't noticed, I'm using the idea of hearing the word as a moment of religious revelation, not necessarily of somebody knocking on your door to read Bible passages at you. It's more than just hearing someone read. It's more than just evangelism as we understand it and are terrified of it. And it's more than just reading some pastor's selections of the Bible. In the weed metaphor, it's these things, all the things in the world, the cares of the world, the anxieties of the world. The world is insane. The world will break your heart. The world takes so much patience and so much hope and so much potential and longing for something better than it is exhausting. The world is exhausting. And our culture has already turned power and wealth into icons of their own, worshipped daily. And these weeds of worldliness, the disappointment, the hopelessness, they begin to choke our faith because the world is always testing our faith, asking us to live into values that are harder and harder and harder. It's in my grandmother's effort, and in the Little Prince's effort too, that we will see the solution to the weed problem. But there's another type of soil first. It's the good soil, the easiest one to understand. It's the place where things grow. But why do they grow? Think for a moment about what makes soil good. What makes soil a place for growth, a place for life, a place where God's light can grow? My grandmother lectured me all the time about making sure that you planted the right plants in the right soil, and that these plants needed more acidic soil and these plants needed whatever. I have no idea what she was talking about. But she knew what made soil good. And what made soil good is the answer to the fate of the seeds, who met the burdens and the weights of the world, the temptations of the world, without foundation, without nourishment, without roots, without formation, without practice, without intentionality. Their not so good, complicated soil makes it hard for them to grow, or their lack of soil makes it impossible. The seeds in the good soil have found a home that is deep and nourishing, and clearly it has an absence of choky weeds. Strangle weeds don't exist in God's garden. In that soil, the seeds are welcomed, made home, watered, nourished, given light and care. And clearly somebody is dealing with those darn weeds. I am convinced now it is my grandmother's job. But what my grandmother pulling those weeds, as I start to reprocess that memory, right? She was defending the life of her plants, of course, who had become her surrogate children in her later life. These things that she cherished and loved, from the wily weeds that she did plant on purpose because she thought they were pretty, to those horrible strangleweeds. And she cared for her plants and flowers as individual things, knowing that they needed certain things. They needed individual things. They needed certain temperatures and certain light. Some had to be brought in when it was too cold because they would never endure the winter. And my grandmother, as much as she may be a saint in my eyes, was not God. She was a human person trying to protect God's creation from the weeds and the scorching sun and the bad soil or the lack of soil. Now, hear me out as I begin to extend this story. Let me ask you this question: who is the sower? There's no wrong guesses. There's an established answer. I'm going to give it to you, right? The sower is commonly understood in some circles, theological brainy circles, right? That's the sower is Jesus. Well, guess what? Jesus has never knocked on my door to read scripture to me. Jesus has never knocked on my door to evangelize to me. So what is Jesus doing here? Throwing these seeds out carelessly, apparently on this soil, recklessly. I think what Jesus is sowing here, the seeds that he throws out into the world, might be something a little more complicated and perhaps a little more mysterious and a little bigger and a little more cosmic, maybe. Because maybe those seeds, the word that Jesus is talking about, is the spark of faith that already lives in all of us. From the moment that God breathes life and love into us, the potential for faith and faithfulness already exists. The spark of faith is given by God in the moment of your creation before you even enter this world. That might just be the seed. And it's when the seed enters the world. We know this. Everybody has worried about a baby or a child or something, right? When the seed enters the world, that's when the seed begins to struggle. And some seeds are indeed planted in souls that live in a world so hard they cannot grow, and they are devoured. And some become enthusiastically religious, but without time spent forming faith, engaging faith, filling the brain and soul and heart with faith, the knowledge of God, that enthusiasm only lasts so long, and I can tell you, sometimes it's only 24 hours. It can be easily beaten down. I'm telling you from experience, the world hurts. And some seeds will land among the Baobabs, the strangleweeds, those horticultural terrorists, because the world is going to do what the world does. The world is going to break our hearts, show us war, show us violence, show us hatred and disappointment and division and loss and grief. The world is filled with those things, and filled with questions about why bad things happen to good people and why good things happen to bad people. And why does God allow war? And why does God do this? Or why does God do that? Or why does this exist? Or why does this happen? Without foundation, without the tools it takes to walk those journeys, to take those journeys, faith gets choked real quick. And the world has a way of making faith much less important, much less of a priority in our lives. Because there are so many other things in the world that will take priority, they will take precedence, they will distract, they will tempt, and they will tell us our value and our worth is in the things of the world, the things we acquire, the power that we have, the idols of the world, and we all know that is a lie. I realize now that the gardening with Grandma was a metaphor ultimately for what she was to me in my life. She was my teacher. She was my elder, my wise one, teaching me to engage the world as safely as she could make it. Not by deflecting when I had moments of pain, not by deflecting when I was afraid or brushing off anxieties, but by engaging with me, talking with me, and nourishing and feeding me with advice and wisdom and love. Because God knows she gave me more light than anything in the world. But she also taught me that the world was hard. She taught me that it took courage and it took strength and it took resilience to get through these things. And she knew it. She knew it well. And all of these things, whether it's the rocks on the path, whether it's the rocks in the weeds, whether it's the rocks on the seeds in the weeds or the rocks or the path, they all have the same problem. They are all under pressure from the world, like all of us when we enter the world. They begin to see the world, and the world begins to do what it does. And people have to learn. They have to learn what it takes to be a faithful person in those moments, because it is super easy to be a faithful person in this room. God planted the seed. We are co-creators with God. We are God's gardeners in the care and stewardship of this great, big, beautiful, broken, messy world of ours. And if that's the case, we are stewards of faith too. We are stewards of the development of faith. We are stewards of the faith of every person who comes in our doors. It turns out the seeds die because they are left behind. They are left out. Their faith is not tended to, not engaged, and not affirmed. They instead go to this place and receive judgment and see division and receive looks and chitter chatter. Their weakness becomes a way for us to deflect from our own brokenness. As far as the world goes, we let the church become less important. That's just true. I'm sorry. I know people hate it when I talk like that. We allowed church to become less of a priority because the world needs our attention. The world needs us to be available for so many things that it is hard. We sacrificed it to what we thought was the way we could be more hip or cool, more like the big churches and the mega churches, the ones that have been telling us lies for decades, but we wanted to look like them and act like them. So we decided, it's cool, right? You come to worship when you feel like it and you do all that stuff, right? And we were so busy collecting seeds, we forgot that part of our job was to help them grow. And if you believe my little experimental extension, if you believe my exegesis here, that gives me incredible, powerful hope. Because what this parable tells us is that it doesn't have to be that way. It means that we can make things grow again. We can make things grow too. And that means we can engage the faith of the broken and the lost and the left behind around us. And we can awaken that spark and feed that spark and give the seed what it needs to grow: love and forgiveness, kindness and compassion, empathy and hope. The nourishment to grow, the courage to grow, the vulnerability to grow, and the resilience to grow. And we give them the water, the living water of Jesus Christ. And we give them the light of God, the brightest light of all, that scorches nothing and makes all things grow. We do that. That's our job now. The seeds have been planted in their places. It is time for us to go to the places and rescue the seeds. And maybe it is time, dare I say, trying not to sound like a crank, that maybe it is time to make this religion thing important again. And maybe it is time to understand that in this space, we find relief and rescue and hope. We can heal. We can build. And we can grow. Amen.